An arrogant passenger mocked an older man until he realized it was Clint Eastwood. You won't believe the conclusion. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and please complete our 1,000 subscribers for more inspiring stories. The hum of activity enveloped the boarding gate for the early morning flight from Phoenix to Los Angeles. Passengers shuffled forward in orderly lines, clutching coffee cups and carry-ons, their expressions a mixture of fatigue and purpose. This was a first-class boarding group with an air of exclusivity, yet restrained energy. Among them, one man stood out not just for his tailored navy suit or the polished leather shoes that gleamed under the terminal's fluorescent lights, but for his air of superiority that seemed to demand attention. This man, in his mid-40s, had the demeanor of someone who'd spent his life climbing corporate ladders, gathering accolades, and never once questioning his place at the top. He wasn't merely traveling. He was asserting his dominance even among strangers. As he walked towards the gate, his leather briefcase swung in perfect rhythm with his steps, his glance at the other passengers filled with thinly veiled disinterest. Soon he was comfortably seated in his first-class seat, scrolling through emails on his tablet as other passengers filed in. That's when he noticed him, the older man who shuffled down the aisle with only a small bag. By the businessman's standards, the man was not dressed for first class, sporting a tan jacket, a plaid shirt, and a pair of worn loafers. His face, though marked by time, held a certain calm, like someone who had seen enough of life to remain unruffled by its trivialities. The older man settled into his seat quietly, adjusted his jacket, tucked his bag under the seat ahead, and leaned back to gaze out the window. To most, he might have seemed unremarkable, a model of modesty and simplicity, but to the businessman, he was an anomaly. The younger man glanced at him, then at the flight attendant assisting a few passengers to their seats. With a sly grin, he leaned over, ensuring the older man could hear him. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be," he said with a smirk. A few heads turned, subtle reactions from nearby passengers. The older man, however, didn't react. He glanced at the businessman briefly, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips before turning back to the window. The lack of reaction seemed to irritate the businessman. Undeterred, he continued, "What's the occasion? Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" His tone was sharper this time, laced with condescension. Yet the older man didn't bite. He simply adjusted his seatbelt, keeping his gaze fixed on the tarmac. His silence was louder than any response could have been, fueling the businessman's arrogance. The flight attendants began their pre-flight checks, and the businessman leaned back, satisfied with his attempted humor. But as the plane started to taxi, something about the older man's calm demeanor started to gnaw at him. It wasn't just the silence, it was the quiet confidence, the unshakable sense of self that seemed out of place in a world where appearances meant everything. But the businessman wasn't ready to let go. For him, the flight was just beginning, and he was about to learn a lesson he'd never forget. Once at cruising altitude, the cabin settled into its familiar rhythm. The occasional ding of a call button, the rustling of newspapers, and the soft murmur of conversations filled the air. But the businessman, seated just a row away from the older man, couldn't let the interaction go. There was something about the older man's presence, his calmness, his refusal to engage that felt like a challenge, though he couldn't quite explain why. He crossed one leg over the other, leaning slightly into the aisle, glancing at the man who continued to stare out the window. The businessman's lips curled into a smirk, deciding to press on. "I'm curious," he said, loud enough for a few passengers nearby to hear, "what brings someone like you to first class? Big lottery win or reminiscing about the good old days when planes were powered by propellers?" A few passengers exchanged glances, their discomfort evident, but no one intervened. The older man didn't react immediately, taking a slow, measured breath before turning slightly towards the businessman. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The older man's gaze was steady, unbothered, almost as if he was assessing the younger man's intentions. Then, without a word, he turned back to the window, his expression composed. The lack of reaction only emboldened the businessman. He leaned back in his seat, speaking louder now, his voice dripping with mockery. "Not much for conversation, huh? I guess you'd rather sit there thinking about the days before Wi-Fi and smartphones." He chuckled to himself, his tone making it clear that he thought he'd won some imagined contest. The older man remained silent, folding his hands neatly in his lap, adjusting the cuff of his tan jacket in a subtle gesture that seemed to say, "You're not worth my time." Nearby passengers shifted in their seats. A woman in her 50s glanced at the businessman with disapproval, while a young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, their eyes darting towards the older man. The tension in the cabin grew, but no one stepped in to stop the scene from escalating. The businessman, oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, turned to another man across the aisle, a fellow professional in a pressed suit. "You know," he began, gesturing towards the older man, "people like to complain about progress. But I can't imagine wanting to go back to their time. No cell phones, no tech, no real innovation. How did they even survive back then?" The man across the aisle gave an uncomfortable laugh, clearly not wanting to get involved, but the businessman didn't notice or care. He continued, "They always talk about how things were better, but it's just nostalgia. The world's moved on. It's better now, no matter what they say." The flight attendant approached, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle, her professional smile slightly strained. She reached the older man's row and leaned down. "Mr. Eastwood," she said warmly, respectfully, "would you like coffee or tea?" The moment she spoke those words, the businessman froze, his tablet slipping from his hands onto his lap as the name hit him like a bolt of lightning. Eastwood? His mind raced, disbelief washing over him. Could it be? The older man turned towards the flight attendant, offering her a polite smile. "Coffee black, please," he said in a calm, steady voice. The businessman's jaw tightened as he processed the name, the voice and the face now taking shape in his memory. Clint Eastwood. The Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor and director whose reputation preceded him in every room, every space. And here he was, sitting just a row away, quietly enduring the businessman's condescension. A ripple of whispers began to spread through the cabin as passengers caught on to the revelation. "Is that really him?" One woman murmured to her husband. "I think it's Clint Eastwood," another passenger whispered excitedly. The businessman's face turned pale as the truth settled in. The man he'd been mocking wasn't just any older passenger. He was a Hollywood icon, a figure synonymous with strength, resilience, and wisdom. The gravity of his mistake hit him all at once, leaving him speechless, but the realization was only the beginning of his lesson in humility. The businessman sat frozen, the weight of recognition pressing down on him like a lead blanket. Clint Eastwood, the name echoed in his mind as he struggled to connect the dots between the iconic figure he'd grown up hearing about and the quiet man in a tan jacket who had absorbed his jabs without protest. He stole another glance at Eastwood, who was now calmly sipping his coffee, seemingly unaware or simply unbothered by the whispers spreading through the cabin. Passengers leaned toward one another, their murmurs growing louder as they realized, "That's Clint Eastwood, isn't it?" A woman a few rows back said excitedly to her husband, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is," he replied, craning his neck for a better view. The businessman's ears burned as the words reached him. He slumped in his seat, wishing he could vanish into the cushions. The quiet conversations around him only magnified his embarrassment, each one a spotlight on his foolishness. He clenched his hands around the armrests, his mind racing. How did I not recognize him? How could I have been so blind? But it wasn't just the fact that he hadn't recognized Eastwood. It was how he'd spoken to him. Dismissive, condescending, mocking. He'd treated him like an outdated relic, and now the realization of his error felt like a physical blow. Finally, he managed to speak, leaning slightly forward, his voice quiet, hesitant, a stark contrast to his earlier arrogance. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he said. Eastwood turned his head slowly, his piercing eyes locking onto the businessman's. It wasn't an aggressive look, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of look that stopped people in their tracks, filled with quiet authority and the wisdom of someone who had seen and endured much. "Yes," Eastwood said simply, his voice steady and calm. The businessman opened his mouth, but words caught in his throat. What was he supposed to say? Sorry for being an ass? Sorry I didn't recognize you? Sorry for treating you like you didn't belong here? None of it felt sufficient. I didn't realize, he stammered, his words trailing off awkwardly. Eastwood raised an eyebrow, waiting, his silence only amplifying the businessman's discomfort. "I didn't mean to offend you," the businessman finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Well, I didn't realize who you were." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. He set his coffee cup down on the tray table, leaning back slightly in his seat. "And if I wasn't who you think I am?" he asked, his tone measured but sharp. The businessman blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" Eastwood tilted his head, his gaze never wavering. "If I were just some ordinary guy in a plaid shirt, would that make the way you spoke to me okay?" The businessman's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The question hit him harder than expected, and for a moment, all he could do was sit there, staring at the man he had so arrogantly dismissed. The murmurs in the cabin quieted as passengers tuned into the exchange. Even the flight attendants paused, their eyes darting between Eastwood and the businessman. He swallowed hard, his face flushed with shame. I guess not," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Eastwood gave a small, almost imperceptible nod as if that was the answer he'd expected all along. Then, without another word, he picked up his coffee and turned back towards the window, signaling the end of their conversation. But for the businessman, the moment was far from over. The lesson Eastwood had delivered, calmly, succinctly, with more impact than any raised voice or angry retort, hung heavy in the air, inescapable. The businessman sat stiffly, his mind spinning. Clint Eastwood's words were like a mirror reflecting his arrogance and assumptions back at him. He wanted to apologize again, to find the right words to mend the damage, but his confidence, once so boastful, was now absent. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward again, his voice low and tentative. "Mr. Eastwood, I owe you an apology. I wasn't trying to—" Eastwood raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence, but his expression remained calm. "You don't need to explain," he said, his tone even but firm. "What's done is done, but there's a lesson here if you're willing to hear it." The businessman nodded quickly, his eyes wide, eager for redemption. The cabin seemed to quiet, as if even the other passengers were waiting for what Clint Eastwood would say next. Eastwood leaned back, his fingers wrapping loosely around his coffee cup. "People always think respect is something you earn by being someone important, someone with a title or reputation," he began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "But real respect, that's not about who the other person is, it's about who you are." The businessman's breath caught. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Eastwood's words hit him square in the chest, cutting through all his excuses with their simplicity. "You see?" Eastwood continued, his gaze steady. "Respect isn't conditional. It's not something you give out based on what someone looks like, what they're wearing, or whether you recognize their name. It's about how you carry yourself, how you treat people even when you think no one's watching." The businessman felt his face flush with shame. He had built his life on success and status, priding himself on being self-made, yet here he was, learning the most basic principle of decency from someone he had so carelessly dismissed. Eastwood took a slow sip of his coffee, setting it back down. "I've been around long enough to know that people make quick judgments. They think they got someone figured out the moment they lay eyes on them, but those assumptions—" He gave a slight shake of his head. "They say more about the person making them than the person they're about." The businessman swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He wanted to say something, anything, but the weight of his own guilt silenced him. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad," Eastwood said, his tone softening slightly. "I'm telling you because I hope you'll think about it the next time you look at someone and decide they're worth less than you." For a moment, the cabin was completely still. The businessman sat motionless, his eyes fixed on Eastwood, who now turned back towards the window, his demeanor as calm as ever. The businessman's mind raced. He thought of all the times he had dismissed people in his life, co-workers, strangers, friends, because they didn't fit into his narrow definition of success or relevance. How many opportunities had he missed to connect, to understand, because of his own arrogance? But as he sat there grappling with the weight of his behavior, He realized that Eastwood's words weren't just a rebuke. They were an invitation to change. As the flight continued, the businessman remained silent, his thoughts a mix of regret and introspection. The hum of conversation around him seemed distant, a backdrop to the storm inside his mind. Clint Eastwood's words echoed, each sentence hitting harder. Respect isn't about who the other person is, it's about who you are. He glanced at Eastwood, who sat peacefully looking out the window as if the exchange was just another moment in his life. There was no animosity in his expression, no lingering irritation. It was as if the lesson had been given, and Eastwood had moved on, leaving the businessman with his thoughts. And those thoughts were relentless. The businessman began to replay not just this interaction but others, moments where he'd judged too quickly, dismissed too easily. He thought about the intern he'd ridiculed, whose idea later became successful, credited to someone else. He thought of the janitor he'd never acknowledged until he needed help. He thought of colleagues, neighbors, strangers whose stories he never cared to hear. Each memory weighed on him, a realization of how his arrogance had shaped his interactions. He had lived believing that success and intelligence gave him the right to look down on others, to measure their worth by his standards. But Eastwood's words shattered that illusion. He shifted uncomfortably. He was unused to feeling small. He prided himself on control, on commanding rooms. Yet here he was, humbled by a man who spoke the truth quietly. A memory from his childhood surfaced. His father, a strict but fair man, had said, "Son, how you treat someone who can't do anything for you says more about your character than anything else." At the time, he dismissed it, too young and confident to think it applied. Now, sitting in first class, those words felt profoundly relevant. He glanced around, seeing the quiet admiration for Eastwood. Passengers who hadn't looked up from devices before now whispered about him, but Eastwood seemed not to notice or care. His confidence wasn't performative. It was who he was. The businessman felt envy, not for Eastwood's fame but for his sense of self. He realized his confidence was tied to external markers, his job, salary, possessions. Without them, who was he? Could he command respect, or would he crumble under his insecurities? He looked at his hands, realizing how tightly he gripped the armrests. Slowly, he relaxed his grip, taking a deep breath. There was no undoing his words to Eastwood, no erasing this flight's embarrassment. But he could learn. For the rest of the flight, he stayed quiet, his mind on Eastwood's words, thinking about the kind of person he wanted to be, one who commanded respect through kindness and humility. He knew it might be late, but he had to try. As the plane descended, one thing was clear. This wasn't just another flight, it was a turning point. The landing gear deployed, the cabin lights brightened, and flight attendants checked seatbelts. For everyone else, it was routine, but for the businessman, this flight was transformative. He glanced out at the Los Angeles skyline, usually an anticipation source, now a reminder of who he'd been. A man measuring success by power, blind to his character's flaws. The plane touched down and the businessman took a deep breath, steadying the storm within. Eastwood's words pressed on him. Respect isn't about who the other person is, it's about who you are. His world had shifted, confronting truths he'd long avoided. The cabin filled with landing sounds, seatbelt signs, gathering belongings, chatter. The businessman moved slowly, his mind too preoccupied for mundane details. Seeing Eastwood rise calmly, he felt like a child caught misbehaving. Eastwood gave a knowing smile. "Take care of yourself," he said, leaving the businessman stunned. Those words were not just goodbye. They were a call to be better. As he followed into the terminal, he noticed how others admired Eastwood's passage. He didn't demand respect. He earned it with quiet dignity. The terminal's bustle was jarring after the flight's introspection. He thought of all the judgments, missed connections, and the person he wanted to be, one giving respect freely. At baggage claim, he paused, pulling out his phone. Instead of work, he typed, "Be like Eastwood," a commitment to change. This flight had altered him in ways he was still understanding. Sometimes the most profound lessons come from quiet moments, revealing our true selves. Stepping into the Los Angeles sun, he felt humility, a hope for a new beginning with an open heart and mind. If this story touched you, share it for a humility lesson. Subscribe for inspiring narratives. What would you do? Discuss in comments.